Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. On the show today is Michaela Boehm. She is joining us from California. Her house has just burnt down, so excuse any bad sound quality. We're both making the best of it. Originally from Austria, she's well known for her work in sexuality, intimacy with couples work, a strong background in Kashmir tradition, as she can tell us about, also psychotherapy, addiction, I believe, too, worked with David Dada for a long time. She comes highly recommended to me by some friends that have been at her workshops. So welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
So first of all, can you tell us this strange context we find ourselves in, that there's sort of fires raging across California, and you're in someone's garage today, right?
Yes. Well, yes. It's a converted studio, and this is where I will be living for the time being, not in the converted studio, but in the adjacent house, because my house was completely burnt down about a week ago. And so we're still in a disaster area, and, I don't want to spend too much time talking about it yet, because I'm still processing it.
Yeah.
And dealing with things and, trying to make sense of the fact that I essentially have lost absolutely everything.
Blimey. Well, I'm sorry for your loss, and thanks for joining us nonetheless. And, if you want to talk about it, that's fine, but it's important. Thanks for sort of saying that's the context you're joining us today from. And the question I normally begin with is, how did you get interested in the body?
Well, how did I get interested in the body? Well, I have a body, so that should be the first answer there. And I think the way I was raised and in the context in which I was raised was very body-centered because I grew up in Austria, and I grew up in Salzburg, which is a fairly small town in Austria, and I grew up outside of Salzburg in the countryside. So being outside, being in nature, moving, hiking, skiing, climbing was a completely normal way of life. And my father particularly had a very strong emphasis on sports and outdoors and moving the body and using the body as the body should be used. And the background to that is that my father had a very bad accident when I was 4 or 5, where he fell off the back of the house for 2.5 stories, and he was paralyzed from that fall, and he literally clawed his way back to movement and to pretty full mobility within a few years. So his emphasis on the body and movement and using the body properly, both emotionally and physically, was very, very strong. And so that's, I think, how I first became interested in the body. And then I've been pretty much doing, varieties of yoga and movement and dance and all kinds of sports ever since I was a child. And my teacher, the woman whose lineage I now hold, I'm now the lineage holder of the lineage of my teacher, which is a Kashmir Shaivism tradition. That particular teacher was also very intent on embodiment as a means of using the full faculties of the body for both intuition, proper decision making, dealing with stress, dealing with trauma. So it was a very somatically informed training without it ever being called that, of course, because those traditions precede somatics by several thousand years, probably. So it was never called somatic, but it certainly. And then I get very involved, as you were saying in your introduction. I both have a pretty strong background in trauma therapy, and also I was involved in a drug rehab, in a celebrity drug rehab in California for quite a while, where everyone was dual diagnosis, so meaning they had addictions and personality disorders or other disorders of a mental kind. And most of that was very strong trauma. And in the course of dealing with very strong trauma with the people I work there with, I developed a whole method of kind of a non-force, non-imposed somatic movement. It's called the nonlinear movement method. That allows people to get out of freeze, and that allows people to start feeling and sensitizing to all the sensations in their body. That's both actual physical, emotional, mental. And so it went from there. So that's the quick and dirty. There's a lot more to that, and I use, and I nowadays also teach nonlinear as a modality for both accessing pleasure, sensitizing the system, undoing trauma patterns. So I've taken my love for the body pretty far.
Great. So there's loads of great topics we can open up here and over the show. Why don't we start with your definition of embodiment? This is the Embodiment Podcast. So what is embodiment to you?
Yeah, I would say, and I think I introduced him. I have a co-teacher, a man named Steve James, who is a genius of the body, and who started way earlier than I did. He started with 5, and his standard definition for our trainings and the way we do work with it is essentially that we're looking at embodiment as an intimacy, right? It's a phase of intimacy with oneself and then with others. So it's the being aware of the sensations that arise through the body. And of course, those sensations are not necessarily always pleasant sensations.
And can I jump in there a minute? Do you have a distinction between the kind of simple body awareness or mindfulness of the body and this, as you say, intimacy with the body? Is there a distinction there for you, or is it just a more kind of poetic way of saying it?
Well, it's not so much poetic as it is the fact that you're sensitized to the sensations that arise through your body. And that has, you could say, a mindfulness component, if you want to say so. But it also has other components like the ability to feel beyond what's pleasant, right? It also means feeling underneath certain aspects of embodiment, and I'm making here quotation marks, that are just the creation of strong sensations to override the more subtle sensations that people don't want to feel. Like, lots of people do like very vigorous, whatever the hell, people do, where the body is screaming from the...
I've pointed this out before. If people are in, say, a hot yoga practice and they're, the muscles of the body are screaming, then they can't feel the sort of subtle sensations of disquiet kind of deeper into the body underneath that kind of muscular system. So it's
Exactly. So that's why we're calling it intimacy with sensations. Right?
There's something I like about that term as well, because it sort of fits my experience. And I was meditating for some years and would be like, okay, now I am paying attention to my body as a separate thing. And then there's another way of doing it, which kind of came up with some time, which was different from just paying attention to the body, which is being with the body. And it's quite hard to describe the difference. I'm really thinking out loud. I was teaching last night and saying, look, it's not just about paying attention to the breath, it's being intimate with the breath. And so I very much like that description, and I'm trying to figure out exactly what I mean by that when I say that.
Yeah. Well, Steve can go into great detail on that because he's also a very prolific meditator, and like I said, kind of an embodiment genius in that way. So he defines it very specifically because there's so much, like you said, that people think of embodiment as so many different things. And so we're slicing it in the way that you are intimate with the sensations. You are paying attention, but paying attention kind of from the inside out and not from the outside in.
Yeah, that's nice. I was just on a major yoga forum online today, and people were saying they're sick of the word embodiment. It's a buzzword. It doesn't mean anything, and it's bullshit. And I'd never actually heard that said before, because outside of where you are in the world, in Boulder and Northern California, and a few places like that, it was a pretty unheard of word, and it now seems to be kind of trending. And I think it's worth being kind of rigorous about, like, okay, are we talking about the same thing? What are we talking about? Part of what we're doing on this podcast is offering lots of different voices to that. Yeah. And you talk about Kashmir Shaivism. So this is something I've heard of, but don't know anything about. So for me and everybody else that doesn't know what that is, what is that?
Well, my lineage is a tantric lineage that's passed down just through women. So there's different strains of Kashmir Shaivism. Some of them are very scholarly and passed down through men who've translated texts. There's some wonderful men who occupy the scholarly aspect of that. My lineage is not that. It's a very body and movement centered, kind of a more, shamanistic, in a certain way, ritual practice that deals with the embodiment of deities. So the mainstay of my lineage is deity yoga as a form of exploring kind of the arbitrary nature of, separateness and existence, and also the embodiment of certain aspects that come through learning how to merge and embody a deity. And of course, the final practice of my lineage is the being able to merge with the deity and embody the deity, and another practitioner merging with the deity, embodying that deity, and then as the deities, there's ritual sexual context. But that's 15, 20 years down the line. That's not how you start. You start with very, very, very simple practices of the body, of awareness, of concentration. And then from there, it goes into some pretty fun, esoteric aspects of deity yoga.
So I'm curious, what does that look like? So like you'll become, I don't know, give us a deity, and what would be the practice to sort of get into that? If you can give us a kind of slight sense of that.
Wow, those are some pretty secret things. So I'm not gonna give you.
It's secret. Why is it secret?
Well, because you have to have preliminary practices in order to be able. But I can tell you the basic steps, right?
Yeah.
Basic step is, and those are the steps I also teach. So those are not, they're not secret. But so the basic step is that you are able to translate the body's sensations and what the body feels into movement and reaction. So you become sensitive and you become responsive. So that's the first step. So you're capable of moving what you're feeling through your whole body and have the mind and the emotion integrate whatever that is. So a classic example that applies to everyday life and humans in general, particularly in relationship, is if you're sitting, let's say you're sitting with me and we're having a conversation, and I say something to you, and you're feeling something, but you're not really paying attention, and you're agreeing with me, let's say, and I'm asking you something, or I'm commenting on something that you told me, and then we hang up, and then I'm gone, and you're sitting there. And sometimes in the middle of the afternoon, you go, wait a second, this was really rude, or she really insulted me here, or this really didn't sit well with me.
Mm-hmm.
What an asshole, And then it starts welling up in your body. Now you get mad or hurt or something like that. And then you have to, think about it and process it. And maybe at some point later, you'll start crying, or you call me up and you scream at me or something like that, right? So that's a classic case of your body not being heard, or the early warning signs of a perception not being heard by the rest of your system, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Because in an ideal world, you become so fluent in the translation of what happens in the body into the emotions and the mind that it happens immediately. So I say something and immediately you feel that welling of the anger or the welling and you can feel that emotion. You might not be screaming immediately, but it trickles up and you can go, hold on, what did you just say? Or the body reacts. Maybe it's not appropriate for you to ask me, but your body reacts in a way that it washes out, and then you move on, and then maybe you'll revisit it with me later. But you don't have that lag time. So
that makes sense to me. How do the deities fit in? Are they sort of psychological archetypes, as it were, or how does that fit in with that?
Get there. So this is the first step, right? So the second step then is essentially being able to how shall I say that? Feel yourself in that. Once you know how to feel yourself in that context, you can then feel others, including a deity. In my tradition, it's just done with a deity, or you could feel others, and you can feel into what they are doing, and you can feel with your body their body, and you can feel with your emotions their emotions. And so deity yoga, the way we do it, is a way to feel out beyond yourself and embody other attributes and virtues, so to speak, or viewpoints. So the deity is used in a way to introduce, so to speak, I'm saying this very lightly, like positive quality aspects.
To expand your normal range into something different with a sort of strong sense of that.
Yeah, and so it is archetypal work. It definitely is, right? Because deities are archetypal representations, and they hold certain aspects, particularly in the Kashmiri tradition, most of the Hindu traditions, right? There's a lot of multi-layered aspects that can be brought forth. And so the deity yoga is used to widen the repertoire, so to speak, of the human. There's a lot more to it, but it gets very, complicated. And as you're asking about it, it's essentially a way to embody aspects of oneself that are maybe not as developed previously, and particularly strong aspects, strong positive aspects, or strong power aspects. So it's very shamanic work in a certain way. This kind of work is done in most traditions in either a shamanic or a ritual context.
I've always found it quite hard to work with or relate to gods from the East. I just never had that sort of connection there. I wonder if that's a common experience. It can be a kind of cultural barrier there.
Yeah, it can be a cultural barrier, or because it's fresh, it doesn't come attached to certain previous conditioning. So, for instance, you could do this with Mother Mary, absolutely, right? I mean, and it is done in those traditions as well, right? Where you connect with a saint or a statue or anything of that nature. You could do it with trees, right? I mean, it's not specific to Eastern deities. It's just in my tradition, that's where the tradition comes. But you could connect with a tree in the woods so fully that you can feel the attributes of the tree in your body. You can do it with animals, which it's often done in some of the native traditions, right, where you essentially deeply connect and become one with an animal. And so you could definitely do it with any of your own, within your own religious context. Often why that doesn't work so well is because people have previous programming, right? So if I would ask you to, embody and become Mother Mary, there's probably going to some stuff kick in from what you've heard, how that's a sacrilege or this or that, or, and that sometimes makes it a bit harder. But for some people, as you said, it's so unfamiliar, it's a barrier. And like I said, these are the esoteric practices that come 3, 4, 5 years into, dedicated practice. How it fits into the workshops we're teaching is that we're using the aspects of embodiment, the aspects of sensitization, the aspects of connection, intimacy with oneself, intimacy with another, and then how does that play between two people? How do you use the sexual play to create depth and intimacy? So those are all that comes long before the dating yoga.
Yeah. So I'm trying to find a picture of your day-to-day life. You're traveling around the world. You're doing these kind of 2-day or 4-day workshops, and people are coming to you because they have just curiosity to learn, or intimacy issues, or they're coming as couples. Like the nearest I can imagine, I did a workshop with a then girlfriend for 2 or 3 days in London with, was it Ellie Beren, who was a student of David Data. And I'm sort of imagining it might be something similar. Like, paint a picture of who comes to you and what they come to you for these workshops.
Essentially, what people come for is a variety of things. People come either because they want to learn how to create and maintain a spark, because one of the things that of course happens is you meet somebody, it's all very exciting, you have great sex, all is good, and then it becomes less and less sexually exciting. It might become really nice and wonderful and harmonious as far as the relationship goes, if you're lucky, but the sexual spark goes. And there's specific reasons for that, which we can talk about in a second. And so people can learn how to create sexual spark at will. It's just a skill set. So that's one of the aspects we're working with. We also work with intimacy, meaning the ability to be with another person fully without shrinking back because of previous things you have going on, or because you're just unskilled in that area and you can't keep your eyes open and you don't want to feel things, that kind of stuff. So we're dealing with the whole range of how do you connect with another human being, both sexually and non-sexually. And then how do you create psychosexual skills, meaning how do you work with your body, with your psyche, with the principles of the erotic friction, which is the attraction between two partners. And then from there, people who've done some of that before and who want to take it deeper, then we go into the expression of different aspects of yourself for the sake of the fun of the play. Right, so different flavors, for instance, right? So that people have a variety of expressions to play with in the body, and then we also go into a little bit deeper things as in how do you have skillful sexual encounter in the sense that you're staying deeply connected, not in the technical sense, not touch here, squeeze there, pinch there, but in the how do you work with another person's body? How do you feel another person's body? How do you, feel what that person needs without just applying the cookie cutter approach and things of that nature? But it all goes through the body because, of course, your body is your primary tool of perception when it comes to sex and relationship and intimacy. So sensitizing the body is always the underlying thing.
Yeah, I mean, my wife and I looked at coming to one of your workshops just because, we're intimate, but it's always nice to deepen that. That feels like something we could deepen. We're happily married, but thought, that could be a great thing for us to do together. And also, we're living together now, so there's a certain kind of comfort that can set in it's quite different when we had an international relationship and it would be like I hadn't seen her in a month and I'd come to the Ukraine and there's like, oh my God, it's quite different when you're kind of waking up with someone every single day and even if it's very harmonious and pleasant. So I imagine in some ways we'd be sort of fairly typical or people that could get a lot from your work, from what I've heard. That's one reason I kind of reached out to you. So, I mean, my sense is most of our listeners will be interested in having better or even better sex. So, that's something many people would say, yep, I'd be up for that. I'm not going to push that one away. So what would be your, as you say, it's not so much like touch here or lick there, but what would be your sort of top tips for people on having better sex?
Well, let me tell you, since you're saying that now you're living together and it's no longer this, exciting international relationship, let's start there because that's what most people deal with, right? So one of the main things that we focus on in the beginning and the thing that I've really, got a very close firsthand experience in having worked with couples for 24 years. I've done over 40,000 counseling hours in my careers, and that's a lowball estimate, but it's probably been more by now. So what happens in general is that the things that make a relationship good are not the things that make sex good. And that's a tough pill to swallow.
Mm-hmm. Okay, go on. So tell us both, because obviously I'd love even better both. So, I've got to be a bit careful here, as I don't want to share anything too intimate when I have my wife's permission. Yes. But let me just say, let's say, anyone out there, if you said more great relationship or more great sex, I'd be up for that. You've got my attention. What are the differences between those two things?
Yeah. So essentially, what you have to consider is that relationship is built on sameness. So the more you have in common, the better your relationship. It's pretty self-evident complementary, right? But so in any relationship, not only sexual, but in any relationship, what you're counting on is that you have things in common.
Yeah, similar values. You want to watch the same films. You communicate in the same style. It's all very easy and pleasant.
Yes, and of course, when you meet someone, one of the first things that is really exciting is when you discover the similarities, the sameness. And it's great. You meet somebody else who likes sushi, and you meet somebody else who has some obscure love for 16th century French poetry or whatever, right? And so that's how you connect, and that's very, very exciting. But at the same time as you create more sameness in the beginning of your dating life, you are also very different people, and it's all new and it's all strange, and that makes for great sexual attraction. Right?
Yeah, that's why you go to a hotel and all of a sudden it's sexier because it's an unfamiliar environment. So.
Exactly, because it's different, it's strange, right? But so the relationship aspect progresses along a very specific trajectory, and that is you discover things in common. You discover you have the same values, like you said. You'd communicate in a similar style. You have similar spiritual, aspirations, whatever. You both want kids. You both don't want kids. All of that. So as you discover more and more of the things you like in common, and then spend more time together, and then eventually create common friends, and then a common home, and all of that. The two people who were separate, right? I'm making these things with my hands, come closer and closer together. And now, and you see this often in older couples, in America, they always joke about this, that there's these people who they wear the matching tracksuits and they drive the Winnebago through America. And so they're pretty much the same. They're even looking the same after a while.
Yeah, people still end up looking like their dogs. They also end up looking like their husbands and wives, and they sort of merge into each other in a sort of slightly androgynous kind of blend. Right. Yeah,
exactly right. And now that's the mark of a really good relationship, right? You become very resonant. You become with each other, and that's wonderful. But sexual attraction, we call it erotic friction in my lineage, and also in the way Steve and I teach. Erotic friction is the principle of two separate entities of the opposite kind creating a strong arc of attraction.
So values are similar, but I've always said this about couples, right? The values need to be the same, but there needs to be sexual polarity, right? Whether they're male or female, gay or straight, there's always some kind of polarity at work. And is the risk that polarity sort of merges as the kind of similarity takes over?
Yeah, and it's supposed to, because the similarity is not being polarized. And see why it's so dangerous when people have read a book or two on polarity by whomever, right? They start making it a lifestyle, and it's not a lifestyle.
Got it.
Live there. If you live there, you can't live together.
Yeah, because one of you is going, "Wah," and the other one's going, "I don't want to do that."
That's exactly right. And so the reason why we call it erotic friction is that it is actual friction, not only friction that creates the hotness, but also friction that creates conflict. And most people know that the people they had the most insanely good sex with are usually the people they couldn't get along with.
Yeah, and that's almost like a cliche in kind of Hollywood movies and things, isn't it? It's a sort of the couple that start, Princess Leia and Han Solo. She's like, "You're awful," and it's kind of like this is sort of a conflict there, which then that rouses people in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's that, and so that's what happens, right? Either some people have really great polarity and they fight like cats and dogs, and they're, makeup sex is the medicine of that relationship, but they can't get along. And then there's people who become very harmonious, but the spark goes.
So I think most of the couples I know are more in the latter. They're sort of, except for the odd sort of bohemian one, they're generally people that are really pleasant. They like each other a lot. Like me and my wife, we just like each other a lot. Do you know what I mean? And my lesbian friends particularly complain about this, I think, as well. I think there's some sort of gender difference here. I've definitely heard it from them, almost every lesbian couple I know. So how does one maintain the polarity?
There's a reason for that. I can tell you why that is. And they call it the But there's a word. There's even a word.
Lesbian bed death.
Lesbian bed death, right? There's a reason for that because relationship creates resonance, right? So you have to resonate. You're assimilating and resonating. So you become the same. And women tend to resonate as is for biological reasons that have to do with evolution.
Because gay men seem to have it a bit less and straight couples in the middle. So that's definitely matches my experience. And I've got quite a lot of experience with the gay community.
It's different because they're men, right? So they might have a masculine and a feminine orientation sexually, which is what makes them be together. But biologically speaking, they're men. So they don't tend to resonate. On the contrary.
Yeah,
right?
they're not merging into each other in the same way.
Not necessarily. So, but women tend to, in general, merge with each other and become very similar and even synchronize their body clocks and all kinds of stuff. So two women who want to play on the opposite have a much harder time because their resonance factor is biologically increased, right? But that doesn't matter. It makes no difference because you can learn the mechanics of that and create strong attraction when you need it. Because the thing is, if you have to choose between you get along great and you're sitting next to each other on the sofa and you're sharing a bowl of popcorn and you're all touchy-feely but you don't want to have sex, or you have great sex but you can't get along and you don't agree on anything, I definitely recommend you go with the first over the second.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense to me. It's kind of like people say, "Why do you love your wife?" I say, "Well, lots of reasons, but one, it's just so easy to be together. There's that sort of ease with each other." Yeah. So, what are the mechanics? As you put it, the mechanics. That sounds very mechanical of increasing polarity for those of us who are in relationships that have got very friendly.
Yes. Well, the reason I'm saying mechanics, it's almost like the laws of physics, right? So it's a spark of attraction is distance and opposite poles. That's why some people call it polarity, right?
Mm-hmm.
What polarity means is you have one pole, let's say plus, you have one pole that's minus. And as you pull those, when they're together, you have a short and it neutralizes itself. When they pull apart, the further you pull apart, the stronger it becomes. Right?
Yeah.
So commonly these things are referred to as masculine and feminine, which is a huge pitfall because people confuse woman and man with masculine.
Yeah, I use yin and yang. I find they're too provocative as terms for people. It's too easy to be confused as well.
We call it, in my lineage, it's called Shiva Shakti, but that once again has the Eastern aspect to it. But it's not man and woman. It's your internal masculine and feminine, of which you have to have equal parts in each human, or you won't function, right? All flow and no go is as bad as all go and no flow, right? And so sometimes you can call it go and flow, or the one who penetrates and the one who surrenders, or, whatever you want to call it. Those are two aspects within each human. And then according to your sexual preference, and I'll explain that in a second because I'm holding that very lightly, you decide for the sake of the sexual play, you pull it apart. So, and that's why I'm saying it's mechanics. It's pretty simple. It means in the sexual occasion, one person knows where it's going and one person goes along. Mm-hmm. When you eat, it's not very sexy. When both follow, it's not very sexy.
Sure, that makes total sense. Yeah, I use this in other contexts as well, other than sexual context. I think this is a profound model and really works well in sort of, leadership context or communication, or, it doesn't really work if both people are listening or both people want to talk, right? It doesn't work at all. And to be able to skillfully step into those roles, I was quite surprised the first time I saw my wife interacting in a very yang way with other people, because she'd always interacted in a more yin way with me. And I was like, wow, that's quite different. And it's like, yeah, because you're able to step into both, right? With there's a skill to that.
Exactly. And a properly integrated human is capable of animating both of those aspects. And it's very necessary, right? If you are in a crisis situation and you just go, I don't know what to do, you'll be dead. But if you're in a situation that requires a very relaxed, go with the flow attitude, and you are all rigid and ball busting, that's not going to work either. So you have to be able to animate both. And as a full human being, you should be able to animate both. Now, most people have a preference, not all people, but most people have a preference. Most people, sexually speaking, like either to be taken or be the takers. So
quick question. Do you think the people's life preference is the same as their sexual preference, generally, always, or often not? Mm. So the sort of the submissive secretary who's the sort of dominatrix in the bedroom, that's possible? Or yes. do you think there is a correlation at all?
Cliches, and there are cliches because that's the way it goes. Or the high-powered CEO who in his free time goes and sees a dominatrix.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, we are everything, and our sexual preferences often, not always, but often kind of remedy what we have to do in regular life.
So they're balancing sometimes. I mean, I've seen it both ways in lovers. I've had some that will just be purely the expression of how they are in the normal life, and then others that I'd be quite surprised by. Though I have to say, even with the sort of all the cliches, I think there seems to be less who are like balancing in that way, unless their life's very out of whack somehow, like the CEO whose life is totally yang and totally out of whack. So of course he's going to try and balance that out, compensate for that.
Yeah. I would say that most men who are highly driven sexually and otherwise.
Yeah.
And that's not always the case, but you barely ever meet a guy who is very, very directed and then completely submissive in the bedroom.
Yeah, I find that hard to imagine. Mm.
He's so out of whack in that way. And you will meet women who are just in general very surrendered, and they're not capable of making decisions for themselves. But most women can kick some pretty good ass, but still like to surrender in the sexual domain. Not always, but sometimes. But then there's some kick-ass all the way, and they're also kick-ass in the bedroom.
Yeah, you said something very un-PC, which I want to underline, because I think you could probably get away with saying it more than I can, which is that the majority of women I've had as lovers, been with, or talking to female friends, can be quite kick-ass in life. And, they run a business and they, get on with their shit and they're political and all these other things. But actually, sexually, they're generally pretty submissive. It's generally pretty yin, submissive's a bit loaded perhaps, pretty yin kind of thing. And sometimes that almost comes with a sort of guilt for them. Like they feel like they're not supposed to be, or somehow they're giving up on their feminist principles or something like that.
Well, one has nothing to do with the other, and that's why I don't see that as an un-PC statement, even though now it is, because to me, feminism or being empowered as a woman are two different things, right? You can be completely empowered as a woman, and that means all aspects of you are alive. You don't have to suppress any aspect of you. That, to me, is actually way more important than common feminist principles or agenda, because I personally reserve the right to be anything I want to be to the fullest. And what happens a lot with women who have very kick-ass abilities, I'm certainly one of them, right? I travel for most of the year extensively, teaching, running a business, running a farm, running, all kinds of stuff, creating enormous amounts of bodies of work, writing about them, creating new workshops, all of that. And because of that, and this is a common thing amongst women, the aspects of me that are more personal and private and sexual are not like that.
Yeah.
They're just not like that. My preference is that of surrendered flow. Now, but I'm not having to do surrendered flow in my life, because that has nothing to do with sex. Sex is what I want to do for myself with the people or the person I choose. It's not my life. I'm not selling myself out as a woman in the world by wanting to be the one relaxing in the sexual occasion. Right?
Yeah, and as you say, that's actually more choice and more freedom to be able to do that. And I think people misunderstand yin as being victimy and don't realize that there's actually choice in that.
Well,
you know, if
that's the whole shadow of this whole thing, everything from Tantra to feminism to whatever.
Yeah.
Unexamined stuff. The thing is, what you do sexually shouldn't have anything to do with your life. Should you be fully empowered, capable of making your own decisions and running your life however you choose to? Absolutely. Should you be able to do that same thing sexually? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And physiologically speaking, and there we go to the differences between men and women, as much as they're being whitewashed these days. Physiologically speaking, a woman's energy has to gather and move upwards through her body, when we talk about embodiment, in order to be effective in the world in a doing kind of a sense. Because doing requires that you gather all your energy and you squeeze it into a forward motion. But women's bodies, for the sake of procreation and evolution, are built to have enormous amounts of energy and feeling in the lower parts of the body. And that feeling goes when you have to kick ass all day.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons why a lot of women enjoy being the surrendered, and that, to me, that's a better term than submissive, right? The surrendered aspect of the sexual occasion in the bedroom is because it's the one time where they don't have to call the shots, and it brings them back into their body, and it brings them back into life, and they become life in an ideal world, and life moves through their body, and that's a very powerful and very empowering thing, because women's sexuality and women's feeling and the way our bodies work requires feeling, and particularly feeling in the body and feeling in the lower body. And that goes out the window when you think and kick ass all day. And
Yeah.
so I don't think there's any issue with kicking ass in the world and being surrendered in the bedroom. And like you said, one of the caveats here is, I always say to my clients, you can't give up something you've never had, right? You can't abdicate something that you never owned. It's like the guy says, I'm not into money. I don't like money. I've given up on the pursuit of money, but he's never had a pot to piss in.
Sure. Yeah.
So what are you talking about, man? Right? Like, it's one thing.
I have to find the same thing with guys with non-violence, and they'll be like, saying they're peaceful, and I'm like, yeah, but you don't have a choice because you can't fight. Exactly. And it comes out in weird ways. They're not very peaceful usually.
Exactly. And the same is true in this particular domain. So you don't give up something you don't have. So you're not really surrendered unless you're also very powerful, right? You're just a victim or a doormat or a walkover. And so women's empowerment in the much more direct sense is not making women angry and aggressive for the sake of getting their way. It's making them powerful so that they have choices. And then you decide what you want to give up. And for this, coming back to how do you create spark in a relationship? Well, for there to be spark in a relationship, one partner has to temporarily surrender agency to a trustable partner, right? Not to some.
Sure.
But in your marriage, for instance, and let's not use your marriage since your wife's not here, but in a marriage, right? Both people can go and kick ass, but sexually speaking, if you decide you want to have a really hot sexual occasion, one of you will guide the occasion, at least to begin with. Then it can become more fluid, but somebody initiates something, and somebody knows where it's going, and somebody takes the other person there while the other person opens and surrenders and goes along. That's the definition of great sex.
Oh, and you do some fascinating stuff with this in Russia, where I am now. That's some absolutely fascinating, because there's a lot more sexual polarity here generally. Yes. But you also have this weird situation where after World War II, all the men were dead. And literally all the men, very nearly, all the young men. And the women kind of had to take charge of everything. So you've got this very strange situation when you date in Russia or Ukraine, where there's, on the one hand, very strong sexual polarity, which isn't typical in Western Europe and certainly not in America. And the women here will test your kind of manliness by sort of insulting you and seeing if you react. just in a really aggressive way to see if you're trustworthy, because it's a traumatized society. We'll come on to this maybe next. There's this sense of like not trusting. And then eventually at some point they'll just go, okay, I trust you, you're man enough, you're direct enough. And they switch and go right into this super feminine mode, which is, super caring and super flowing. But they kind of, first of all, they sort of fight you to see if you're able to handle it. That's the sort of typical thing here, and it's a more extreme version of what I think happens around the world. But you really see it at play here. And the first time a sort of Russian girl just insulted me on a date, I was really shocked, because it's something that sort of we'd be too polite to do that in England. Yeah. But then the surrendered side is absolutely fantastic if they kind of trust you. So that's
the thing is, if that's a beginning of the relationship fact-finding thing, right? And like you said, it comes from a wounded place. But in general, a woman is pretty damn stupid if she surrenders to a man who she can trust.
Yeah.
Right? Just makes you an idiot, and then you can't actually complain when things go wrong because you knew you couldn't trust the guy. But this happens a lot in kind of tantra workshops where women go along with stuff that they shouldn't go along because they somehow wishing for this amazing experience, and then they get really, really hurt, right? And so being able to set proper boundaries and being able to make sure that a guy can be trusted is very important. The shadow side of that is a constant ragging on the guy and the constant testing of the guy, which is very toxic.
Yeah.
At some point, when the guy has been found trustworthy and when there is no reason to believe that he's untrustworthy, then that stuff has to stop. Or in a very toxic relationship, right? But the positive aspect of that is that, of course, you shouldn't surrender to somebody who you don't know if you can trust. But once you've decided to trust them, it can't become kind of the game, because for some women it becomes kind of the game.
Yeah, no, I've those relationships. I've been in those relationships. They're very unpleasant, aren't they? It's just like, really, still again, Okay, now you've done so much work with couples. Then, what are some of the sort of top things you've learned from all these couples, these thousands of couples, about best ways to build relationship or intimacy? Like, what are some of give us a few kind of, bullet points, some of the big takeaways from all this experience?
Yeah, well, this is not just my experience. This in the meantime has been studied, but the number one factor in relationships, so we're now talking about the harmonious living between people, right, is generosity. And there's now studies out on that because, of course, people are always going, well, where do things come from? So the people who have staying power in relationship are the people who have a generosity of heart and a generosity of relationship. So you'd be surprised how far praise goes, how far giving the other partner the benefit of the doubt, giving the other partner a little bit more space than you would have the need work to give them, right? So a general generosity, both in action, attitude, and deed, is probably the number one factor for people having good relationships.
Yeah, I remember I was thinking of one partnership I was in years ago, and the person sort of always kind of assumed the worst, and it was so hard work, as opposed to someone who kind of just sort of assumes realistic, but maybe a little bit in your favor. You know what I mean? That benefit of the doubt. And like, that's an example I can think of. And the difference between a partner who assumes a little bit better than is probably possible and someone who would always assume the worst is just unbearable in the latter case.
But also things like going the extra way, making that cup of tea, it over, giving that extra touch, giving that extra hug, giving the praise. Right? One of the things that's so noxious is that when people do things and they're done well and the other person doesn't praise them, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a deal breaker over time.
Yeah, I've seen this in business time and time again. Like, people will leave a well-paid job if they're not thanked.
Right. The same thing applies to relationships. So that's number one.
Mm-hmm.
As far as intimacy goes, that's also a no-brainer. But you asked for bullet points. Do spend some actual time with each other without each other's phones. Meaning actual quality
time.
Time, right? You can't substitute that for anything. It doesn't matter, how technologically advanced we are. One-on-one time away from distraction is one of the big clues of relationship. And it also sensitizes you to your partner's needs and to your partner's body, which of course is the prerequisite for connecting sexually. And then as far as the sexual aspect goes, creating difference. And one of the aspects of creating difference, as we talked with the spark, is spending time apart.
Yeah, I've noticed that. I come back from Russia and it's, I'm working hard, I'm fighting my way through the snow, I'm arguing with Russians, it's a very yang kind of place. And then I kind of come back and I'm like, rah, I've kind of got that charge back again,
Right. And that makes for a good sexual, spark. So spending time apart, like you were saying in the beginning, people, when the spark goes, they go to hotels and then it's great again. Well, why? Because it's different, right? So you have to create difference. And one of the most effective ways to create difference is go and spend time with other people, get other influences, have hobbies that you don't share. So when you come back together, you actually have something to talk about other than pills and, where the dog puked. What a lot of people's conversations are at the end of the day, right? They complain about their job and they talk about their children or animals and what they did right or wrong and what bills need to be paid and did you bring the trash out, and that's not exciting by any.
Sometimes just bringing something interesting, like if we watch a documentary about something we don't normally look at, and it's like bringing interesting ideas in, and then that sparks our relationship because we've got something, there's something else in there.
Yeah, exactly. So those are some of the quick and dirties that if people would actually do, it would make a difference.
Okay, I thought of a video, quick and dirties with Michaela. How about that? So maybe we won't call the podcast that, but it's a fun one. I like that. That's really helpful, and I always like people listening to feel like they're getting some things they can use and things they can go, okay, that makes sense to me. Now, trauma is another big area you're interested in, right? So I know this is really a hot topic. It's fascinating for a lot of people, and potentially hugely toxic to intimacy as well, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, here's the thing, and this is one of the areas that are still very unexamined in the workshop scene, for sure, and also not an area that a lot of relationship counselors are very, very hip on, more now than before, right? Because essentially, there's pioneers in the field who have been at it for many, many years, amongst them Bessel van der Kolk and Dr. Peter Levine. I should say Dr. Bessel van der Kolk and Dr. Peter Levine, to give them their dues, because they've done an amazing body of work on that. But even before you go into the traditional, trauma aspects, the thing that's pretty clear to anyone is when somebody is frozen or in the middle of fight or flight, they're not capable of relating. And that's just a matter of common sense, right? So you don't need to know much about anything other than, even if a hammer drops on your toe, right, you are no longer listening to me.
Yeah. Those systems are antagonistic, aren't they? It's difficult to be, we say things when we're stressed that we then regret because we weren't relating at the time.
Correct. And so the thing to know simply about trauma, and there's lesser cousins to trauma, like overload or stress and panic. They all fall into the same category. Physiological responses that make you less capable, short-term and long-term, depending on how this works out, to connect with another and to yourself, right? So you're no longer able to listen to your own body and to your own sensations, which is one of the big aspects of trauma, right? You become disembodied, which is why embodiment has become the big thing, because a lot of people are very, very disembodied. Some people just don't want to feel, period, but a lot of people can't feel because they had traumatic things that were so strong that when they get reactivated, they're not functional. So you're dealing with trauma, and overload and stress and panic as they're all ways that we as humans can't hear or perceive or deal with the sensations that arise in our bodies and with that in our emotions. And fight or flight are still pretty clear cut, because if you're in a fight mode, well, everybody will know because you're going to be very aggressive. Now, that's not very good, but at least it's something that can be detected. Right?
Yeah, and you can see it. I always say to my students, fight and flight are easier to spot, but freeze is harder to spot because nothing's happening. But that's how you spot it, right? Because nothing is happening.
Nothing's happening. You spot it because nothing's happening, and the person feels fine, right? You ask them, how are you doing? I'm good. Surprisingly, I'm fine. I'm actually quite calm.
Yeah.
It looks calm. Often people who are in a freeze, either perpetually or situationally, look totally zen. Right.
So say what you mean by this, because it may confuse listeners. So you're not talking about someone who's sort of catatonically frozen, like we might imagine a sort of, World War I soldier or something. But what are you talking about when you say freeze? If there's someone still walking around and talking?
Well, let's go through all three of them very quickly, right?
Cool.
So fight and flight are the commonly known ones. Fight, of course, means you're activating your whole system in order to fight, and it has very specific physiological outcomes, one of which is heightened, pulse. Your heart pumps blood everywhere. You might get hot. A massive amount of adrenaline gets pushed out to get your system flushed with the hormones you need. Lots of energy. You get tunnel vision. Your hands and feet might feel a bit numb because all the resource goes towards, kicking some ass. Those are some of the common symptoms. Right? Flight has the same symptoms, but it lacks the aggression and it has the retreat, right? Get the fuck away from it.
Versus in the body, there's a very literal direction to these two, aren't there? Forwards and back. It's very literal.
Forward or back, right? And everything that comes with it. But they both have that fast heartbeat, tunnel vision, perspiration, hot, cold, metallic taste on the tongue feeling, which coincidentally, in parentheses, is also what happens when you have a panic attack, because a panic attack is a I don't know how to say it. Panic attack is a fight or flight response, but to something that's not necessarily physical. It could be physical, but when it's physical, it's usually not called a panic attack, right? Then it's called
Sure.
Freeze is an interesting mechanism where essentially your body powers down for the sake of not being detected, or for the sake of keeping you immobilized in a situation where you have to be immobilized, right? Like, raiders are coming to your village and you are hiding in the bushes with your children, right? That's a definite moment for a freeze response. But freeze, how it more often shows up in the modern world, is that people become less responsive and less reactive, and their whole system powers down to kind of bear what's happening. And so it can be very subtle. Some people are perpetually slightly frozen. They just can feel that much, and you can see it. They have flat affect, meaning it's not much.
Yeah, you'll see that pretty much anyone that grew up into communism. It just has that flat affect. The face just isn't moving much, when people are talking. And tightness in the muscles, chronic contraction in certain muscular bands. Yeah,
very little blinking. It also shows up in the body, right? The lower body is very immobilized, stiff. So it goes from very extreme, which is catatonic, to very mild, which is you're a bit checked out. You can't follow directions that properly. You don't hear everything people say. You're not aware of what's happening in your body. People who are in a freeze sometimes bump themselves a lot, right? They bump against the kitchen cabinet or cut themselves or stumble, things of that nature. So the interesting thing about freeze is that you feel fine for the most part. And so most people are not aware that they're frozen until they unfreeze. In all somatic therapies and treatments, unfreezing the body is very, very important, right? Some people have jump around on rebounders. In the nonlinear movement method, we use a nonlinear movement of the spine to access, the underlying stuff. In somatic experiencing, often the therapist will make the people aware of where they sit and their feet. In trauma triage, often you make people wiggle their hands and feet and make them look down, tell you which where. There's all kinds of
on the light level, this can simply be going for a walk with someone, can't it? Like, I'm not talking about full on trauma response here, but if someone's starting to get into that stressed freeze, it's like, okay, come on, get off the couch, let's have a walk, let's talk about this.
That's where the body's genius comes in, because the body knows how to fix all of that. If you let the body just do its thing. Right? It's when you fuck with the body that it all starts going wrong. But we have a tendency to fuck with the body because, that's just the way it goes. Right?
It's interesting that embodiment came back into psychotherapy, I think, really through the door of trauma, because you simply couldn't ignore the body when it came to trauma. Yes. And it seems like now the body's kind of, becoming much more a bigger thing for many kinds of therapists, but it seemed like it was those trauma pioneers, the kind of people like Pete Levine and Bessel van der Kolk you mentioned, that kind of brought it back into mainstream psychology.
Yeah, no, it's very, very important because, like we started this trauma conversation, you can't relate to anyone or yourself if you're not home.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about how it affects relationship, because I think a lot of people aren't aware of this, or aware of how some of their own relationship patterns may be as a result of trauma, like the inability to trust someone as a trauma response, or the feeling not safe the whole time. And if you don't feel safe, how can you be intimate, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, what's some of those interactions between trauma and intimacy?
Well, I mean, there's, of course, the very, very apparent, right? You have been transgressed upon or violated. And so, of course, anything that looks even remotely like that violation is going to be perceived as one, either mentally or emotionally or physically, or all of the above, right? So on the most extreme level, we're dealing with people who anytime now, a certain thing happens with their partner, they go into trauma response. If the partner isn't very skilled, they might not notice. Let's say this happens during sex, right? And then that person doesn't know the other person's really checked out, because maybe they think they're surrendered or something, but they're really just dead to that moment. They might not even know that they're leaving their body. That's an extreme, right? Then, of course, there's also people who have spiritualized their particular trauma into some kind of a sexual kink, or either spiritualized or sexualized. So they've either spiritualized their trauma into some kind of sacred sex thingy, where they're now being transgressed upon by their tantra teacher the way that their uncle transgressed upon them, right? Or they have certain sexual patterns that come from their original abuse that picks the scab of that particular injury over and over and over. But more often that's those, some people develop certain kinks based on certain abuses. But that's the extreme spectrum. The more middle of the road spectrum is that people get triggered by something that their partner does, and they kind of leave that particular interaction enough that there is suddenly a disconnect, and that disconnect is felt by one or both partners. And depending on how it manifests, it can manifest in aggression, as we said, the fight, right, where the person is being accused of doing something that they might not be doing, or it manifests as flight, where that person just checks out and goes away and even disconnects and runs away, or as a freeze, where the partner isn't capable of participating in the relationship fully.
Yeah.
And there's lots and lots and lots of versions of all of that, from the emotional to the sexual to the conversational, right? And exploring these things in relationship is very important. So it is important to have therapeutic those things. But once you know what you're dealing with, you can't resolve it in your head. You have to resolve it in your body.
Yeah. And I think just you can open up a lot of compassion, just realizing that, hey, maybe this person, isn't into sex right now, has nothing to do with me. Maybe the fact that, for me, it's trauma is often indicated by any kind of overreaction. Like, I was applying for a Russian visa before I came in. There's a visa problem, and I got very, very stressed about it. And then I realized, like, oh shit, this is because of like stuff left over from when me and my wife had all these visa problems, and that was really painful. And I was reacting in a way which was, a little bit aggressive. And my Russian colleagues and my secretary, who basically made a mistake, I think, at some point, and I was really overreacting to that. And then I kind of went, hang on a minute, look, this is a traumatic pattern that's speaking, and I'm deliberately giving an example that's fairly low key, it wasn't overwhelming or anything. But it was like, yeah, and I could be compassionate to myself, and I could sort of explain to them, look, this is something that I'm getting triggered by. It's not you. I'm sorry if I was a jerk yesterday, and be able to realize that I'm being run by a trauma pattern and not thinking it's their fault, thinking it's all about the situation, when actually I'm slightly, that slight disconnect from reality, isn't it? Is what you're living in the past rather than the present.
Yeah. And that's knowing that in relationship, right, then you can deal with it. Like, for instance, like you did with yourself, right? If you're not aware of it and your wife's not aware of it, and you are suddenly this aggressive creature, right? And she takes it personal, and she goes, "You always scream at me," and then you, of course, her stuff gets activated, and then you have World War III, versus her saying, "Oh, he's a bit out of it. Okay," and you should go, "Come, let's go for a walk. Tell me what's happening." You start moving, and you start walking, and you're out in nature, and it's cool, and you get fresh air, and your body moves, and maybe she touches you in some way that brings you back into the body, and suddenly you can go, "Oh, I'm back."
Yeah, sometimes that's enough, isn't it? As you say, like with the lower level stuff, just kind of like a nature, a walk, a gentle touch. And this applies to coaching. It doesn't have to be like couples therapy. I'm thinking of one executive, he was really stuck in his problems, and he just kind of needed to go for a walk in the park, and then all these solutions started coming. People often have it when they're in the shower or they're taking a shit. Their body starts moving, and all of a sudden they have all these great ideas. But well, that's fantastic. So I really appreciate that you're bringing those things together, and it feels like sort of the trauma stuff is of the times as well. It's kind of hot topic. Sometimes these days I even wonder if it's kind of gone too far. There's a sort of level of sensitivity where everything becomes trauma.
Of course, that's definitely true. And the thing is, to coddle somebody from these things is not the right approach, and that because it's I don't know how to say that. Packing somebody in cotton and keeping them in a cave somewhere isn't the way to go. Right?
It's not kind, is it? It's not kind ultimately to do that.
And it makes people non-functioning and like infants. The way is to sensitively and compassionately allow people to be exposed to the things so that their body can work through them. And they become more functioning and not less functioning. And that's very important. Infantilizing people and packing them in cotton so that they don't get triggered at any given moment in time isn't the way to go. Because guess what? The world's a pretty tough place, even in the developed world, in Europe or in the US, right? I mean, if you're not capable of functioning, and less so as your trauma is being coddled, or as you're being coddled so that things that shouldn't traumatize you, it's not a good way to go.
Yeah, I've been getting some interesting feedback the last year or two, as I have a fairly sort of yang approach to teaching. I think people say things like, "You trigger me, but in a way that was healing," or I appreciated that you have that kind of yangness, but you're not abusive with it, And it's something like, actually I'm hearing in the world a real longing for some to be clear, non-abusive, but fairly kind of kick-ass and sort of strong yangness as the world gets kind of mollycoddling and more softer and more kind of overprotecting everything. I'm actually hearing people longing for that, or thanking me personally. I don't think it's just about me. I think it's a wider trend. But I find that quite interesting that that's starting to happen. I wasn't even 5 years ago getting that feedback.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm looking at the time and thinking we might need to wrap this up. Is there anything else what we'd like to talk about before we head off?
Good. I'm assuming you let people know how to find me.
That's the next question. Yeah, where can people find your stuff?
Well, you'll post the website, I'm assuming, right?
That will be on the link. That if people are listening to it on iTunes, they won't necessarily hear it. So if you could tell people the URL.
michaelaboehm.com, which is spelled MICHAELA, B as in boy, OEHM as in Mary.com. So it's michaelaboehm.com. And then there, I know it's a handful. On the homepage, there's a link to my SoundCloud, and there's about 70 hours of free audio of all kinds, lectures, Q&As, interviews. Our interview will go on there as well. So enormous amount of free stuff on SoundCloud. And on the website, of course, is the 2018 schedule. And there's also a link to Steve James's personal website, which has a whole bunch of meditation instruction and resource. He's a very accomplished meditator as well. So there's something for everyone.
I had a look. It's a nicely put together site. It's, it's visual. There's lots of good free content on there. Very generous. The secret of any good relationship, apparently. So I like the website, and I recommend people to have a look at that. And final question.
Yeah.
Go on.
No, I was going to say he's a very interesting guy because he has such an in-depth background in the realms of embodiment and martial arts and meditation. And
is that who you teach with when you're teaching?
Who I teach with. He's the only person I teach with. Yeah. So,
and you're teaching all around the world, aren't you? Workshops here, there, and everywhere.
Doing Europe, the States, and Australia next year. And we're all over Europe, the States, and Australia next year. So we have a full-time travel schedule next year. And there's absolutely everything from 3-hour evening intros to 5-day intensives and teacher trainings and everything in between. Men's groups, women's groups, you name it.
Okay. Well, I hope to get to one of them with my wife at some point. We're just finding the time. We both tend to do workshops at weekends. It's a bloody problem I find as a fellow facilitator. When I find someone good that I want to train with, I can never find a weekend.
I know
that's life.
Weekend, I know. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a real pleasure. I hope you get back on your feet there in California, and that it isn't too painful setting up home again.
Yeah, well, it's a phoenix from the ashes kind of situation. So I will report more on that as I go along. It's all still very, very fresh, and I'm in the middle of it, so I don't want to make any definite statements. So
sure. And
things.
Do you have a final message about the body for our listeners before we head off?
Well, to use it. The body is certainly a use it or lose it kind of a situation. So use it.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.